My name is Ava Reynolds, and I used to believe love was supposed to save you. I thought if you loved someone deeply enough, if you forgave enough, if you stayed calm enough, that love would eventually notice you back. I built my entire world around that belief, around him. He was the kind of man who made every ordinary moment feel cinematic in the beginning. He looked at me like I was a miracle and spoke to me like he was building a future, but I didn't realize the future he promised was only big enough for one person, himself. He said he loved me, and maybe he did, in the way people love what makes them feel powerful. He loved how I made him look, how I made him calm, how I made him right, but not once did he love who I actually was. And I learned that the worst kind of heartbreak isn't caused by cruelty, it's caused by indifference. The quiet way someone stops seeing you while you're still standing right there, waiting to be noticed. The day he told me he was going on a guy's trip, I smiled and said, "Have fun." Because that's what women like me are taught to do. Trust first, question later, forgive always. But when I found what he left behind in his suitcase, something inside me finally stopped begging to be loved and started craving to be free. So stay with me, because this isn't a story about cheating. It's a story about how emotional neglect feels like drowning in someone else's silence, and how I finally learned to breathe again. Before the suitcase, before the silence, there were small golden moments that felt like safety. When I met him, I was 26 and certain that love would be my anchor. He was charismatic in a way that made every room tilt toward him. His laughter carried confidence, and his eyes had that steady, calm people mistake for sincerity. He said all the right things, and he said them like he meant them. I didn't realize that manipulation often comes gift-wrapped in warmth. In the beginning, he paid attention to everything. He learned the way I took my coffee, the songs that made me cry, the parts of my childhood that still hurt to talk about. He said, "You're safe with me," and I believed him. When he touched my hand, it felt like a promise, and when he called me home, I thought I'd finally arrived. But emotional abuse never starts as abuse. It starts as devotion. It begins with over-attention that blinds you to the imbalance growing quietly underneath. He wanted to know where I was, who I was with, what time I'd be back, not in anger, but in affection. "Text me when you get there," he'd say, and I'd smile because it sounded caring. I didn't notice how easily concern turns into surveillance when love is built on control. Months passed, and his attention became my routine, something I depended on without realizing it. He was affectionate but unpredictable, affectionate enough to keep me hopeful and distant enough to keep me insecure. When he withdrew, I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I'd said something wrong. I kept adjusting, softening, shrinking, believing that if I could just be more patient, he'd love me the way he used to. The truth was, he never stopped loving me the way he used to. He just loved me best when I was easy to manage. He liked to tell stories about his stress at work, how people misunderstood him, how the world was unfair. My role was to listen, to soothe, to make him feel invincible again. I became his emotional nurse, patching up his ego while mine quietly bled out. When I tried to talk about my own worries, he changed the subject or sighed like I was exhausting him. He didn't yell. He didn't insult. He just disappeared into that heavy silence that made me desperate to fix things. I'd apologize for things I didn't do just to bring him back. That's how the cycle works. Withdrawal followed by relief, punishment followed by crumbs of affection. It's a rhythm that trains your nervous system to mistake anxiety for love. Friends noticed before I did. They said I seemed smaller, quieter, different. But I brushed it off because when you're inside a toxic relationship, you become its defense attorney. You rewrite every red flag as a misunderstanding, every manipulation as miscommunication. And the more you defend them, the guiltier you feel for doubting them. He called me sensitive whenever I expressed pain. "You overthink everything," he'd say, smiling just enough to make it sound like a joke. And I laughed along because laughing was easier than starting another Cold War. Slowly, I began doubting my memory. Did he actually say that, or am I imagining it? Did he forget that promise, or am I being unreasonable again? Gaslighting isn't always dramatic. It's repetition. It's rewriting the truth until you can't recognize it anymore. The little things disappeared first. He stopped texting good morning, stopped asking about my day, stopped holding me without distraction. But every few days he'd drop in with tenderness, enough to restart my hope. That's how emotional neglect sustains itself. It feeds you in fragments just enough to keep you hungry. I started measuring my worth in how often he noticed me. When he was kind, the world lit up. When he was cold, I convinced myself I deserved it. I kept shrinking, making myself easier to love, and he kept taking the parts that made me whole. The loneliness wasn't loud. It was surgical. It didn't scream, it drained. There's a special kind of emptiness that comes from sleeping next to someone who stopped choosing you long ago. I would lie awake, watching the rise and fall of his chest, wondering how someone could look so peaceful while I was unraveling beside him. And yet I stayed, because leaving meant admitting the fairy tale had turned into a cage. I told myself every relationship had rough seasons, that love required endurance, that all couples fought. But we didn't fight. We just disconnected. And I mistook his silence for maturity when it was actually punishment. He controlled the emotional temperature of our home. When he was affectionate, everything was warm. When he withdrew, winter came overnight. I learned to survive on emotional rations, grateful for any scrap of closeness. By the time he mentioned the guy's trip, I had already learned how to pretend everything was fine. He said it casually, like he was doing something ordinary. I smiled, nodded, even packed some of his clothes because that's what good partners do. Inside, though, something cold flickered awake, a knowing I had silenced for too long. The part of me that still recognized patterns whispered, "Watch him." But the rest of me, the loyal, trained part, said, "Trust him." So I did. Because after years of being conditioned to doubt myself, trusting him felt easier than trusting my own intuition. That night, as he kissed my forehead and said, "Don't wait up," I realized how practiced I'd become at pretending that indifference was love. I told myself he deserved a break, that I was being paranoid, that everything was fine. But the truth was already waiting in his suitcase, folded neatly between the clothes I ironed. And though I didn't know it yet, the discovery that would shatter everything was only hours away. The morning he left was ordinary in every visible way. The sun pushed through the curtains in soft gold, the kettle hummed on the stove, and the apartment smelled like detergent and faint cologne. He moved around calmly, whistling as he packed. I folded one of his shirts, the blue one he wore on our first date, and placed it neatly in his suitcase. He smiled and kissed my forehead, the same practiced gesture he used whenever he wanted to seal off a conversation before it could begin. I told him to have fun, and he told me not to worry. It sounded simple, safe, normal, 3 words I had spent years mistaking for love. When the door closed behind him, the quiet felt heavier than usual. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, the kind of silence that waits for something to happen. I made myself coffee, scrolled aimlessly through my phone, and told myself I was being ridiculous. He deserved a weekend away. He worked hard. He needed space. But beneath every rational thought, something restless moved, the instinct that women learn to smother. That whisper saying, "You know better." I walked into the bedroom to tidy up, an act of distraction more than care. The suitcase he'd packed sat open on the bed, half-zipped. A sleeve of one of his shirts stuck out, and without thinking, I tucked it in. That's when I saw it. A corner of something plastic, shiny under the morning light. I pulled it out. Condoms. 3 of them. Unopened. Ordinary. New. My mind didn't scream. It simply stopped. For a second, everything went still. The fan, the birds outside, even my breath. People imagine betrayal as explosive, but it's quieter than that. It lands softly, like dust after a demolition, and you stand there staring at the ruins, wondering when it fell apart. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding that small piece of proof that my trust had been living on borrowed time. I told myself maybe it meant nothing. Maybe he'd just forgotten them from some old trip. Maybe I was overreacting again, just like he always said I did. That's how deep the conditioning goes. You learn to protect the person who's hurting you, even from the truth. The rational part of me built stories faster than I could stop them. Maybe he bought them years ago. Maybe his friends put them there as a joke. Maybe Maybe. But each maybe cracked like glass under the weight of what I already knew. The evidence was simple. The denial was elaborate. I stared at the suitcase for a long time, memorizing the shape of deceit. Then I put the condoms back exactly where I found them, closed the zipper, and stood up. I wasn't ready to explode. I was ready to observe. That's the thing about emotional neglect. It teaches you silence so well that even your rage comes out quiet. I decided to wait, to watch, to let the truth reveal itself fully before I said a word. Not for revenge. For clarity. Because after years of being gaslit, you learn that proof is your only language of survival. He texted me that afternoon. On the road. Love you. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Love you. How easily they travel through wires detached from meaning. I replied, drive safe. Nothing else. I didn't owe him warmth when all I had left was evidence. That evening I sat by the window, watching the city dissolve into orange light. I thought about all the times I'd felt crazy, dramatic, or paranoid. Every time I'd been right. Every time he'd told me I was wrong. The realization wasn't loud, it was steady, like an old engine starting again after years of being silent. My intuition had never been broken. It had been silenced. I opened my laptop and searched for the name of the resort he'd mentioned in passing months ago, Baylight Shores. The images that appeared didn't look like anything he'd described. It wasn't rustic cabins and fishing boats. It was couples' spas and candle-lit dinners by the ocean. The kind of place that promises intimacy, not friendship. A knot formed in my stomach, heavy and familiar. Still, I needed proof beyond instinct. I checked our joint credit card portal. The list of transactions loaded slowly, each line another heartbeat. Sea Salt Bistro, 2 entrees, 2 cocktails, a shared dessert. The timestamp matched the first night of his trip. Another entry, Baylight Shores Resort, couples aromatherapy session. I took a photo of the screen. Then another, because I knew what would come next. The denial, the charm, the manipulation. I needed something that couldn't be rewritten later. By midnight, I had a folder of screenshots sitting on my desktop. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I just stared at the evidence and felt the last piece of illusion collapse quietly inside me. That was the moment I understood what psychological abuse really is. It's not the lie itself. It's how small it makes you feel for questioning it. It's the way you start apologizing for asking for the truth. The days that followed blurred together. I went to work, answered emails, laughed at jokes, but inside, everything was still. I checked the tracker I'd placed on his car months ago after he'd lost his phone during another mysterious weekend. The map showed a perfect blue dot at the same resort. No fishing trip, no cabins. Just the truth, blinking quietly on my screen. It didn't hurt the way I expected. It didn't tear me apart. It confirmed what my body had known long before my mind was ready to admit. I was living with a man who needed me quiet to keep his lies loud. And I had been quiet for too long. That night, I opened the curtains and let the cold air fill the room. I realized that silence can be both weapon and armor. He had used it to control me. Now I would use it to reclaim myself. I didn't need confrontation yet. I needed composure. I needed to remember who I was before his voice replaced my own. And as I turned off the lights, I whispered something I hadn't said in years. Not to him, but to myself. You're not crazy. You were never crazy. You were just being gaslit by someone who called it love. After the discovery, time stopped behaving the way it used to. Days didn't feel like days anymore. They felt like scenes in a film I wasn't directing. The morning light still came through the blinds, but it didn't warm anything. I moved through routines like a ghost. Shower, dress, coffee. All the things that once made life feel steady. But steadiness had become an illusion, and illusions, once cracked, don't fade quietly. They echo. He texted every morning. Good morning, beautiful. The kind of line that used to melt me. Now it just sat on my screen like static. I read it, typed good morning back, and realized how easy it is to lie when lying has become survival. I wasn't ready to confront him yet. I wanted to see what he'd do when he thought I still believed him. That's what happens when you live too long under psychological manipulation. You start studying the patterns, the way you used to study the person. I watched him through digital windows, his location dots, his transaction times, his social media trails. Every piece aligned with the truth I already had, but my mind refused to call it final. There's a strange loyalty that trauma builds inside you. The belief that if you just love someone enough, they'll stop hurting you. I had to unlearn that. Love doesn't fix people who enjoy being broken. At work, I caught myself staring at spreadsheets, forgetting what I was doing. My colleagues laughed, joked, invited me to lunch, but their voices felt far away. My world had shrunk to two things: the evidence on my laptop and the ache in my chest. Every time I thought about confronting him, I imagined the expression he would wear. Confusion first, then hurt, then that disappointed calm he used whenever I caught him in something. He was an expert at turning guilt into pity. He'd look at me like I'd wounded him by noticing. I'd been through it before, not with cheating, but with everything else. Every time I asked for more time, more affection, more truth, he'd sigh and say, "You always make me feel like I'm failing." And I'd feel guilty. Guilty for wanting basic respect, guilty for needing care. That's the cruelty of emotional abuse. It convinces you that your needs are the problem. Now, sitting alone with the proof, I began to see the whole pattern. The nights he fell asleep at the office, the weekends he was too tired to talk, the way his phone always faced down, notifications muted, like secrets need sleep too. The more I saw, the less I recognized myself. The woman who once laughed easily was now calculating, cautious, strategic. I hated that he'd turned me into someone who needed proof to feel sane. A week passed before he came home. The day he did, I'd already made my decision. Not to confront, not yet, but to collect everything. I made copies of the screenshots, printed statements, logged dates and times. I became my own detective, not because I needed revenge, but because I needed closure that couldn't be rewritten later. When you've lived with a gaslighter, truth is never safe unless it's documented. He called on his way back, his voice light, carefree. "I missed you," he said. The words hit differently when you know they're hollow. I told him I missed him too, and in that moment, I felt the split inside me widen. The part that loved him and the part that was already leaving. That night, when he walked in, he looked exactly the same, tanned, smiling, eyes too bright. But something had shifted. I saw the way his gaze slid past me, like he was already thinking about his next lie. I saw the distance in his posture, the way he hugged me like a man checking a box. I noticed the faint trace of a perfume that wasn't mine. Once upon a time, that detail would have broken me. Now it simply confirmed what I'd already accepted. We sat at dinner, and he told stories about the trip, the fishing, the jokes, the endless laughter. I smiled when I was supposed to, nodded at the right times, but inside I was miles away. I could hear the hollowness in every sentence. The lies weren't even creative anymore. He had gotten lazy, too confident. That's what happens when someone believes you'll never leave. They stop pretending to deserve you. Later, while he showered, I looked around our apartment. Every object had a memory. The couch where we first kissed, the framed photo from our anniversary, the candle he bought to make the house smell like home. None of it felt like mine anymore. Emotional neglect turns your own home into a museum of false moments, rooms full of memories that lie to your face. I realized then that leaving wasn't about hating him. It was about rescuing the parts of me that still believed I could fix him. I remembered how he once said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Back then, it sounded romantic. Now it sounded like a confession. He needed me to stay small so he could keep feeling big. In the quiet that night, I thought about the way he had slowly rewritten me, how he taught me to apologize for feelings, to shrink my emotions so he could expand his comfort, to doubt my reality until it matched his. That's the genius of psychological abuse. It doesn't destroy you in one blow. It dissolves you quietly, so when you finally disappear, no one can tell exactly when it happened. But here's what he didn't know. Dissolution isn't death. It's transformation. When you've been erased long enough, you start learning the art of rewriting yourself. The next morning, I watched him sleep, peaceful, content, unaware. I thought about how many times I'd stared at that face believing it was safety. Now it looked like a mask I had finally learned to see through. I got dressed, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight sharp against the window. I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. It wasn't numbness. It was readiness. For years I'd lived reacting to him. Now I would act for myself. I wasn't sure what the confrontation would look like yet, or when it would happen. But I knew it would. And when it did, I wouldn't beg or cry or plead for him to understand. I would simply show him the truth and walk away from it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can say isn't "I love you" or "I hate you." It's "I see you now." The morning I chose to confront him didn't feel extraordinary. There was no thunder in the sky, no dramatic storm to match the one inside me. The air was still, almost reverent, as if the universe knew something was about to end. I woke before him, made coffee, and stood by the window, watching the city wake up. For months, I had been preparing for this moment, not by rehearsing words, but by learning silence. The kind of silence that isn't fear, but power. He stirred around 9, yawning, stretching, calling my name with that familiar tone that used to melt me. When he walked into the kitchen, I saw the faint trace of guilt in his eyes, a flicker, barely there, but enough. He smiled and reached for his mug. I handed it to him, steady, polite. There was a time when the smallest tension between us would make my hands shake. Not anymore. We sat across from each other. He talked about his plans for the day, something about meetings, errands, meaningless chatter meant to fill space. I listened quietly, letting his words run out like a faucet dripping dry. When he finally looked up, confused by my stillness, I said, "I know." The words landed gently, but they split the air open. His brow furrowed. "Know what?" he asked, and for a second I almost admired how quickly he slipped into denial. It was muscle memory for him. I didn't answer. I just slid a small stack of papers across the table. Credit card statements, screenshots, a printed map. The truth, laid out neatly between us like a meal neither of us could swallow. He stared at them, then at me, and the color drained from his face. "Ava, it's not what you think," he began, his voice soft, pleading, trained. I'd heard those exact words before, in smaller lies, easier ones. I watched him search for the right tone, the balance between guilt and authority. That was his skill, sounding believable even when cornered. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't listening for his explanation anymore. I was listening to my own heartbeat, steady and certain. I said, "You don't have to explain. I already did the math." He reached for my hand, and for the first time I didn't flinch because of love. I flinched because I saw the manipulation in the gesture. That hand had guided me, comforted me, and erased me. I pulled it back slowly. The message was clear. He leaned back, his expression changing. Hurt, then anger, then something colder. "You went through my things? My private stuff?" he said. There it was, the shift from defense to offense, the classic pivot. He wanted me to feel guilty. But guilt is powerless when you've seen the truth. I looked at him and said quietly, "I went through our life. I just found what you left behind." He laughed, short and bitter, trying to regain control. "You're being dramatic." "It was one mistake, Ava. Everyone makes mistakes." That word, mistake, used to cut me open. Not anymore. "A mistake is spilling coffee," I said. This was a choice. He looked at me for a long moment, realizing maybe for the first time that I wasn't bluffing. That I wasn't the same woman he'd trained to stay. His voice softened again. "I love you," he said. "I don't want to lose you." It was almost cruel, how easily he used those words, how quickly he tried to patch a wound he caused. I stood up. "You already did," I replied. My voice didn't tremble. It was steady, almost tender. And that tenderness made him panic more than anger ever could. He started pacing, muttering about how I was ruining everything, how I was overreacting, how we could fix this if I just calmed down. That was his final attempt, to reframe my clarity as hysteria. I watched him spin his story one last time, and for the first time I didn't argue. I didn't beg him to see my side. I didn't defend my sanity. I just let him talk himself into irrelevance. When he realized I wasn't engaging, he stopped. The silence grew heavy. I walked to the bedroom, pulled out a small suitcase, and began to pack. The sound of the zipper filled the air like a verdict. He followed me, still trying. "You're throwing us away for nothing," he said. "You'll regret this." I folded my clothes slowly, deliberately. "Maybe," I said, "but I'd rather regret leaving than keep regretting staying." He stood there, speechless for once. His silence used to terrify me. Now it felt like freedom. I closed the suitcase and turned toward him. "You taught me something," I said. "You taught me how easy it is to lose yourself when you love someone who only loves your obedience. But you also taught me how to find myself again." He tried to reach for me one last time. I stepped back. There was no hate in the gesture, only finality. "Take care of yourself," I said, and I meant it. Not as forgiveness, but as release. When I walked out, the hallway smelled of rain. Each step felt heavy and light all at once. People think leaving is a single decision, but it's thousands of tiny ones. Every time you choose your sanity over their chaos, every time you choose silence over manipulation, every time you choose yourself. By the time I reached the street, the world looked different. The sky wasn't brighter, but I was. I hailed a cab, sat in the back seat, and watched the city blur by. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like a problem to be managed. I felt alive, and as the car pulled away, I realized something simple and stunning. I hadn't escaped him. I'd simply remembered the door had always been unlocked. Freedom didn't roar. It exhaled. The first morning in my new apartment, I woke to sunlight on bare walls and the sound of traffic below. There was no one snoring beside me, no phone buzzing with demands, no mood to manage. Just air, ordinary, forgiving air. I made coffee in silence and realized how loud peace actually is when you've lived without it for too long. For months, my body had been wired for survival, waiting for his footsteps, his tone, his verdict. Now the only footsteps were mine, steady and certain. I didn't cry. I just breathed until breathing stopped feeling like a test. Healing wasn't cinematic. It was paperwork and fatigue, therapy appointments, and long walks through streets that didn't recognize me. I spent weeks relearning the texture of ordinary things, the sound of my own laughter, the smell of rain, the way music feels when it isn't background noise to someone else's moods. At first, the silence felt cruel, like punishment. But then I understood it was space. Space to expand back into the person I used to be before I learned to live small. People asked what happened, and I always said, "We grew apart." The truth was heavier than explanation could hold. How do you explain emotional starvation to people who think abuse only counts when it leaves bruises? He never shouted, never hit. He just withdrew love like oxygen, one quiet act at a time, until I mistook suffocation for intimacy. That kind of neglect doesn't end when you leave. It echoes. You hear it when you doubt yourself, when kindness feels suspicious, when calm feels temporary. But every echo fades eventually if you stop answering it. Therapy taught me language for what I'd survived. Gaslighting, emotional regulation, trauma bonding. Words that sounded clinical but felt like freedom. Naming something steals its power. I began to see the pattern clearly. How he'd built a world where my worth depended on his moods. How he'd trained me to mistake anxiety for love, silence for stability, exhaustion for devotion. Realizing that didn't bring rage. It brought grief, the kind that cleans you out. Some nights I'd sit by the window, watching the city lights and remembering the version of me that stayed. I wanted to forgive her, not for him, but for myself. She loved deeply, even when it hurt. She believed in potential because no one had ever told her that love without respect isn't love at all. I whispered to her, "You did your best. Now rest." Slowly, life returned. I started painting again, cooking meals that tasted like care instead of convenience. I went out with friends and didn't check my phone every few minutes. I laughed until my stomach hurt. I learned that happiness after neglect isn't a sudden burst. It's a quiet consistency, like rain returning to a dry field. One day you notice the grass again and realize it's been growing the whole time. He reached out once. A message that said, "Hope you're okay." It was short, rehearsed, safe. The kind of apology that asks for reassurance, not forgiveness. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I was free. Silence, once my prison, had become my boundary. Months later, I found his old sweater in the back of my closet. I held it for a moment, waiting for the ache that never came. Instead, I smiled, a small private smile, for the girl who used to believe love meant endurance. She'd finally learned that love also means leaving. I folded the sweater, placed it in a donation bag, and whispered goodbye. Not to him, but to the story that once defined me. Healing changed my rhythm. I stopped rushing to fill empty spaces and started letting them breathe. I stopped explaining myself to people who didn't listen. I stopped performing calmness to be acceptable. The peace I had now wasn't fragile. It was earned. It came from knowing I could survive the loss of someone who once convinced me I couldn't. Sometimes when I walk past couples holding hands, a flicker of sadness passes through me. Not jealousy, just memory. The memory of believing love was supposed to hurt a little. That devotion meant self-sacrifice. Now I know better. Love that costs you yourself isn't love. It's debt. The woman I am now wakes up early, opens the curtains, and thanks the morning light for showing up. I no longer measure my worth by someone else's attention. I no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. I'm not healed completely. Healing isn't a finish line. But I'm whole enough to know I never needed to be rescued. Sometimes I revisit that day in my mind. The suitcase, the discovery, the quiet heartbreak. It doesn't sting anymore. It feels like the prologue to something truer. Because that's what it was. The moment my story stopped being about surviving him and started being about becoming me. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You can't teach someone to see you when they're committed to blindness. You can't make someone hear you when silence benefits them. And you can't keep shrinking in the hope that one day they'll notice your absence. They won't. So leave anyway. The night I finally slept through till morning, I dreamed I was walking through a field of open doors. No locks, no keys, just wind. I woke up smiling. Freedom had found me quietly, the same way pain once did. Only this time it stayed. Now when I tell my story, I don't talk about what he did. I talk about what I learned, that peace isn't found in promises, it's built in boundaries. That healing isn't about revenge, it's about return. And that sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is stop waiting for the apology that will never come and give it to yourself instead. He once said it was just a guy's trip. Maybe it was. But for me, it became the journey that led me home. They say some endings are loud. Doors slamming, hearts breaking, tears that sound like thunder. Mine wasn't. Mine ended in the quiet clink of a suitcase zipper and the sound of my own footsteps walking away. That's the thing about emotional abuse. It doesn't explode, it erodes. It turns love into duty and affection into endurance, until you forget that you were ever allowed to feel safe. But healing isn't a miracle, it's a decision. It's the moment you stop asking, why did he do this to me? And start asking, why did I keep forgiving it? It's forgiving yourself for confusing consistency with love and silence with peace. So, if you're listening to this and something inside you feels familiar, don't ignore it. The truth doesn't always shout. It whispers softly, patiently, waiting for you to answer. When you finally do, the world won't change overnight, but you will. You'll breathe differently, walk differently. You'll start belonging to yourself again, because freedom doesn't begin when someone stops hurting you. It begins the moment you stop letting them.